Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to objectively map out a really fascinating intersection of ideas. We're looking at the philosophical convergence of Yuval Noah Harari's concept of AI agency and Slavoj Žižek's psychoanalytic concept of subjectless knowledge. We'll examine exactly how these two ideas merge into a framework known as synthetic epistemology, and we'll break down these theories step by step. To do this, we're going to navigate this conceptual terrain across 5 structured sections, from tool to agent, knowledge without a knower, synthetic epistemology, the problem of responsibility, and finally, the threshold human. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. From tool to agent, Harari's distinction. So consider the basic contrast between a traditional tool and an agent. A traditional tool, something like a printing press or a hammer, merely executes a very specific assigned task, right? A printing press doesn't wake up and decide what book it wants to publish today. An artificial intelligence system, however, operates as an agent. It actively participates in decision-making processes, it generates its own options, and it produces completely original linguistic content based on general objectives.
Harari defines this agency as a system capable of participating in decision-making and developing new courses of action. And notice here that the true impact of this agency doesn't necessarily emerge through physical control of the real world. We're not talking about robots physically taking over a factory floor. Instead, it emerges through the algorithm's participation in the symbolic structures constructed by human beings. We're talking about algorithms determining credit risks, evaluating legal texts, and deciding what millions of people consume every single day.
This functional rise of AI agency naturally bridges us to a much older, more structural question about the nature of subjectivity itself. Harari shows us that AI clearly has agency. But does that actually mean there's a someone inside the machine? Is the mere capacity to act, and to act effectively enough to make something a subject?
That brings us to Section 2, Knowledge Without a Knower, Subjectless Systems. To answer that question, we can look at Slavoj Žižek. He asserts that while a large language model can maintain coherent discourse, it lacks the internal division and structural gap that actually define a true Lacanian subject. When you talk to an AI, it uses first-person pronouns, it answers your questions, and it honestly feels like a fluid conversation. But from a Lacanian standpoint, a subject isn't just a collection of capabilities. A true subject is defined by its internal divisions, its failures, and a structural gap between itself and what it says. So the AI behaves like a subject, but ontologically, it is not one.
This gives us a highly specific definition. Žižek describes AI output as subjectless knowledge. It's not a personal I know, but rather a mechanical operation of it is known. The crucial takeaway here is that humanity is now facing systems that act as powerful agents within our linguistic and economic processes, yet possess absolutely no conscious knower behind the information. When you ask a machine a question, you might expect it to take the position of a subject who knows, but the response is actually coming from an entirely subjectless order of knowledge.
Section 3. Synthetic Epistemology, the new framework.
This historical separation of knowledge from a knowing subject requires a completely new framework. Synthetic epistemology focuses on what happens when content produced without a knowing subject begins to function socially as real knowledge. From this perspective, the fundamental problem isn't just a technical debate over whether the AI truly understands what it's saying. The real issue is that institutions, legal systems, and everyday people are using this synthetic output as if it were legitimate human knowledge.
You can see this shift clearly when we compare the models. In the classical schema of knowledge, there's a direct relationship between a subject and an object. Someone looks at the world, experiences it, and makes a judgment. But in a synthetic information environment, that direct relationship is now mediated by layers of data, algorithmic processes, and interfaces. You ask a question about the world, but the representation you receive has already passed through vast mathematical models. There is no singular human subject behind the representation, assuming it as their own speech.
This brings us to Section 4, the problem of responsibility, dispersed causal chains.
Because representation is no longer solely the product of human judgment, the very subject structure of representation is changing. Humans are no longer the direct source of all the cultural representations that generate real effects in our world. In the past, if a human being made an incorrect judgment, you could just ask them for their reasons, right? You could investigate what they saw, what they thought, and what evidence they relied on. But when an error occurs in this new synthetic structure, there is no single subject within the machine whose intentions or internal reasoning can be interrogated.
The reality is
that the causal chain in a synthetic system is incredibly dispersed. It involves the initial data selection, the complex design of the model, the entire training process, the specific prompts inputted by the user, the way an institution ultimately uses the tool, and finally the output itself. Because the chain is scattered across all these different elements, the participation of a technical system cannot automatically transfer the normative burden to the system itself. You can't just blame the algorithm. The responsibility is completely dispersed.
Which leads us to our final section. Section 5. The threshold human, a subjective position.
This absence of a responsible subject inside the machine synthesizes these concepts into a new paradigm, a proposed solution to our dispersed responsibility. The human subject does not disappear in the age of AI, rather we transition into a new position called the threshold human. The threshold human is someone who no longer produces knowledge alone, but is required to interpret, question, limit, and ultimately bear critical and ethical responsibility for the results produced by these synthetic systems.
Let's break down how this works sequentially. Expanding on Harari's original distinction between intelligence and wisdom, synthetic epistemology adds a strictly necessary third step. Step 1 is intelligence, which simply solves a problem. Step 2 is wisdom, which asks which problem is actually worth solving in the first place. And step 3 is responsibility, which requires determining what kind of world that solution will construct, whom it might exclude, and whether its consequences are acceptable. Computational capacity can give us intelligence, for sure, but it cannot give us that third step. We are officially entering an epistemic world, where we just don't need a human knower to process extraordinary amounts of information. Ultimately, the role of the threshold human is not to try and compete with the machine or to reclaim a monopoly over all knowledge production. Instead, the task is to perceive the epistemic void alongside the machine's answer. It is to maintain our ethical grounding in a synthetic world, stepping in exactly where the machine's subjectivity inherently falls short.
As this explainer concludes, I want you to consider this foundational question. We are facing autonomous systems that are actively producing real-world effects. So if knowledge can now circulate without belonging to a subject, how will we ensure that subjective responsibility is not lost in the process? It's a profound question regarding our ongoing ethical duty, and one that the concept of the threshold human challenges us to answer objectively. Thank you for joining me to explore this source material today. Keep questioning and keep learning.